when President Obama, when he was giving a speech earlier about addressing the issue, he's talking about tensions likely to go on even further before there are remedies to solve it. Do you agree?
I do. Unless we move to actually solve the problems, I would argue that it's really in our hands. If we allow the same challenges and problems that we are experiencing now to go on without change, quite frankly, many would argue that that is the clinical definition of insanity.
Right.
We want to see things improve. We want to prevent these kind of things from happening ever again. We must do something about it.
Do something about it. What are the some things, sir, you have in mind? Very briefly, help us to understand.
First, we've got to change the law itself. One of the things that Mr. Obama said was that we want to see the kind of conversations and discussions occur, but that has to lead to actual policy changes. Policy changes in how law enforcement interacts with local communities, policies that prevent the pull the gun out and shoot first, but actually give some oversight to police officers. They must be retrained on that policy, and then we must utilize the power of government to actually enforce those policies and demand accountability.
What do you think, Mr. Ruskin? Of course, Mr. Shelton has been talking about advice should be given to the police officers. Coming from a police background, what do you make of it?
Well, I agree with Mr. Shelton. I think that dialogue between police and communities are important. Certain cities are well advanced in that process. New York City doesn't have the violence that other cities have. And that's because the police department in New York City has spent the time and the effort not only to train the officers in the sensitivity of the different areas that they patrol, not only black, but Hispanic, Asian, and other minority groups, but have also spent the time in making sure that when people want to protest, they can do so in advancement of their First Amendment rights, and they do so in a peaceful manner. What's amazing to me is in New York City, there was a recent demonstration where police officers were walking along demonstrators who were demonstrating Black Lives Matter in the United States. And what they were doing is the demonstrators were saying, what do we want? Dead cops. When do we want it? Now. And yet the New York City Police Department was not only able to walk with them and basically have them abide by the law, but not have any kind of skirmish or demonstration that was out of hand.
Mr. Ruskin,
and I think that that's what's important.
Okay, Mr. Ruskin, may I just follow up with two different questions, briefly, very. One is it a technical issue or is it a mindset issue when we're talking about the police interactions with the so-called minority inside your country? And secondly, when you talk about New York City, it is a very diversified city to begin with. It is so unique compared to almost all the other cities inside the US. So when you are saying New York is doing so good, is that kind of possibility also could be available elsewhere in your country? Two questions for you. Thank you, sir.
Those are very, very good questions. And to answer the first question, I think it's important that New York City be one of the models. There are other great cities in this country where blacks and whites and police get along very, very well. What happens now in the cycle of 24-hour media, you have two shootings, one in Louisiana and then one in Minnesota, which basically are one-sided because the police are doing, and law enforcement and prosecutors are now doing the investigation into those shootings. And a lot of times what originally broadcast is not true. Like in Ferguson, when Michael Brown was shot by the officer, the true story was not told until after the full investigation, the autopsy.
Yeah, but my question, sir, to you is it a technical issue or is it a mindset issue of the police when it comes to its interactions with the demonstrators and when it comes to interaction with the local community? Very briefly from you.
I think it's both.
Okay.
Very briefly, I think it's both, and I think that certain police departments in this country have to spend more time in getting to know the community that they're policing.
All right, there we go. Let's go to you, Mr. Dunham. Yes, blame the media. Everybody does that when there's a crisis. We also heard that from Mr. Ruskin. He is smiling at the moment also. But let me ask you about this. What do you make of these tensions? You witnessed that when you were a very young reporter back a few decades ago. And there are now also arguments going on. The police are saying we are being unjustly accused and also targeted. They were embattled. But the minority community, they are thinking, why did it take so long to solve these problems? We've already taken decades when it comes to racial tensions. So what do you make of the arguments coming from all sides? That can the current system be able to accommodate all of these demands and attitudes?
I think change has to happen. Attitudes, I think, are the biggest challenge right now. I will say first, media is guilty of sensationalism. I think that, especially in the United States, the 24-hour news networks have just blown up stories and have tried to find the voices that are the most extreme.
Okay, let's just imagine from tomorrow on, there's no media anymore.
Okay.
There's no media in the world.
So
will that tension be resolved?
No, because I think that there is a real mindset issue in a lot of police departments. And Dallas, where I worked, where there was a lot of racial tension in the 1970s and 1980s, Dallas is one of the models for community policing, for police working with the community. If you saw before the shootings there, police were taking pictures with demonstrators. The problem is Baton Rouge, where there were demonstrations and arrests in Louisiana, their police department looked like a military unit out, and the enemy was the community. I think you really have to have retraining. But you also have to have rules. You do have to have policy changes as well. I think the United States has come a long way. President Obama is right. It's not the 1960s, but there still are racists like the 1960s, and there still are police departments that target minorities. I mean, there was a senator from South Carolina who today in the United States was talking about how he's been stopped 7 times, an African-American senator, conservative Republican senator, and he talked about how humiliating it was as the senator for the state of South Carolina to have white police officers stopping him for traffic stops. There has to be an attitude change in the country, and there has to be a dialogue. I think if there's not a discussion, these issues will simmer.
Well, Mr. Shelton, help me, because I have a very short memory of the United States, but you do have much longer. So didn't you have those conversations already? Back in the 60s, in the 70s, the civil rights movement, which has been advocated once and again every year being celebrated, where is those conversations? And what is the nature of the conversation you had, and what about the conversation you should have?
No, very good. And certainly it begins with the conversation. One of the biggest problems we've had in this country, of course, is we've also lived in very segregated communities. So different perspectives develop, different points of view. So in essence, when we've talked about the issues and challenges of police brutality, racial profiling, and other issues and relations between the African American community and local law enforcement, they're issues that don't really get resolved. That is, the problems get laid out, the issues arise, but no major change is made. One of the big problems right now, and I agree that our country has moved forward in many ways, there's so much more that needs to be done. So if you think about things now, last summer we had some very high-profile police shootings. Even a 12-year-old kid playing with a toy gun shot in his chest by a police officer that arrived, and within 2 seconds arriving at that playground, decided that that toy gun was a real gun and killed the kid. In essence, we've seen other cases of unarmed African Americans in which this has happened. The more recent cases, again, are showing that disconnect between law enforcement officials and the people they're serving in the African American community. So you're right, the dialogue has to happen. The dialogue must lead to real policy change. The real policy change must be utilized to train police officers to do a better job. And those police officers then, based on that policy, have to be held accountable. We can do that if we have the will to do it. The research has been done, the data is available, and the anecdotes are horrifying. So in essence, we know that it can be done if we simply have the will to do it.
Okay, because I'm coming from outside the United States. I see a crisis going on in your country, but at the same time, it is natural for me to look at your history. So Mr. Dunham, you also helped me to understand this. What has been the nature of those conversations supposed to be about racial tensions or resolve racial tensions? Were they just about political correctness, or were they about really changing the mindset of every individual inside your country?
Well, the words political correctness get me to react negatively.
I know, I already saw that.
Because it always means something that I don't agree with. I think yes, there are people who try to intimidate other people into not doing things for what would be supposedly politically correct. I don't think that's the problem. I think that a lot of demagogic politicians are using the term to try to silence people who disagree with them. The discussions you have to have are discussions like Tim Scott, the senator I talked about, was saying, and talking to other conservative Republicans, or Newt Gingrich, who's one of the people on the short list for Donald Trump for vice president, who inelegantly said that, quote, normal white people don't understand what happens to African American men. Yes, that is the kind of thing there has to be discussion. My wife is from Southeast Texas, which is an area where there is a lot of racial tension, and a lot of white people just believe that black people are different. We're all human beings. You have to start with an honest discussion.
Right. I can see Mr. Dunham already becoming very passionate at the moment he's talking, not as a journalist anymore. Right. But having said that, though, we see this passion and compassion about this issue, not just in daily conversations or on TV, but rather also among the presidential candidates. So what would that mean when the presidential campaign, a lot of that is seasoned by this issue?
Right.
And what would those rhetorics mean for the future direction of finding solutions to these issues?
Well,
Mr. Dunham, very briefly from you.
I'm not about to endorse any presidential candidate.
I hope you're not here.
But a lot depends on who's elected president. Hillary Clinton's slogan is "Better Together." Her whole idea is the togetherness. Donald Trump's campaign is appealing to a lot of disaffected white voters. So a lot will depend on who is president and then what they say as the leader of the country.
All right, Mr. Ruskin, what do you make of a presidential campaign vis-a-vis what is going on, the racial tensions inside our country? Does it help, or is it likely to lead to even a worse situation, more tensions?
It depends on which candidate you look at. If you look at Donald Trump, as Mr. Dunham just said, you're looking at a man who is spewing rhetoric that is not helping the racial divides in this country. You look at someone like Hillary Clinton, where she's more looking to bridge those gaps. But, to the point that was made before, it depends on the area of the country that you're looking at in policing relative to these racial divides. When cops are going out and they feel like they have targets on their back, they are reacting appropriately to protect themselves, and maybe sometimes overprotecting. With 800 to 900,000 law enforcement officers in this country, you're dealing with a large population of law enforcement people. If you go to a demonstration and bottles and rocks and other debris is thrown at you, then police react accordingly with tear gas and riot gear accordingly. In Dallas, last week, they weren't wearing riot gear. They were wearing their normal uniforms because, as Mr. Dunham said before, the racial divides in Dallas have been diminished by the administration and by police training.
Okay, we are seeing Mr. Ruskin really want to explain on the behalf of the police as to how they work. But Mr. Shelton, what do you make of it? The issue of race has once again become a very hot debated issue inside the presidential campaign. How is it likely to be politicized? And politicizing it, what does that mean?
Oh, I think there needs to be more discussion within the political campaigns. I mean, keep in mind that as we're moving into the November election cycle, you have two distinctive political parties. Both parties are on their way to their national conventions. Next week, the Republicans will meet. And in addition to actually deciding who their nominee is to run for president as a Republican, they're also deciding what their policy agenda is. They're determining their platform. The Democratic Party will be doing the same thing the very next week. We've been following both political parties to see how they're addressing these issues in their policy agenda, that is, their platforms. And what we're seeing is that the Democratic Party is very specific about the issues it wants to address. I think even Hillary Clinton has said that we have got to address the issue of having data-driven policing.
Right.
We've got to do the research, we've got to craft the policies and move it forward. We are hoping to see the same thing happen from the Republican Party as well.
Okay.
NAACP is nonpartisan. We're just looking at agendas. But it can indeed be done. But it's going to require changing those positions.
I see.
We're also going to have to begin looking at the police departments as government agencies. That's what they are.
Okay,
Government
we're
agencies
having a
have
big
regulations
list.
that oversee it.
Yeah, we are having a big list to do, but at this moment we're wrapping up our show.
Sure.
But before we go, we want to share some numbers with you. Some have drawn the parallels, as both of you mentioned, between 1916 and 1968. Obama says the U.S. isn't as radically divided as it was during the strife and riots that racked the country in the 1960s. Let's take a look at these numbers. A New York Times CBS News poll released Wednesday found that 70% of Americans say race relations are generally bad and lowest since 1992, and there's growing pessimism. Only 9% of Americans believe race relations are getting better, while 59% think they are getting worse. Of course, there is a margin difference when it comes to every poll. Having said that, though, before we go, what is the solution?
I think the solution is honest discussion. Mr. Shelton said it very well, too. The other side of it, we have to have an honest discussion about the risks that the police face as well. But we have to have honest discussions of communities of color and police.